When you think of Michel de Montaigne, well, you probably picture him alone, right?
Yeah.
Up in his study, maybe, deep in thought, writing away.
That's the classic image, yeah. A solitary figure. But what if that's not the whole story? What if it's maybe even a bit misleading?
Misleading how?
Well, Philippe Desan's biography, Montaigne, A Life, really challenges that picture. It digs into, a whole range of sources.
Okay.
And Desan makes this compelling case that Montaigne wasn't really this detached philosopher at all. He argues Montaigne was actually quite politically savvy, ambitious even.
Ambitious. So the essays,
Yeah.
they weren't just philosophical musings.
Desan suggests they were, in part, strategic, tools used within the really complex world of 16th century French politics and society. It's a fascinating rereading.
Mhm.
And actually, for those of you interested in digging into complex ideas like this, looking at different angles, the AI book analyses on the Mindful Moments YouTube channel are pretty useful. They can really spark some critical thinking.
Right. Different ways of looking at things. So, okay, this political ambition in Montaigne, where did it start? What's the root?
A lot of it goes back to his family, the Iquams. They were, a classic example of social climbing during the Renaissance.
How so?
Well, they started out as merchants, but then in 1477, they bought the Montaigne estate. That purchase basically elevated them into the minor nobility.
So they bought their way in, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. It was about acquiring land and status. And this upward mobility, this drive to establish themselves and succeed within that noble class seems to have really influenced Michel.
Okay, so that's the family background.
Yeah.
What about his upbringing, his education? Did that lean towards philosophy or public life?
Definitely towards public life. His education was quite innovative for the time, very humanist. He actually learned Latin as his first language.
Wow, really?
Yeah. And he went to the Collège de Guyenne, which was a top school. This kind of education wasn't just about book learning. It was designed to prepare young men for public service. Gave him all the tools, rhetoric, critical thinking.
The skills you'd need for a career in politics or law back then.
Exactly. And that's where he headed. From 1556 to 1570, he was a magistrate in the Parlement of Bordeaux.
Which wasn't just a local court, right? It had real political weight.
Absolutely. It was a major regional court, very influential. So he was right in the thick of it. Legal disputes, political maneuvering, the religious conflicts tearing France apart at the time. He was a royal counselor.
And this is also when he formed that famous friendship with Etienne de la Boétie. We always hear about their deep intellectual connection.
Yes, and that connection was certainly real and profound on a personal level. But Desan adds another layer. He argues it was also, importantly, a political alliance.
A political alliance? How?
They shared certain ideals, moved in similar circles, and after La Boétie died tragically young, Montaigne very strategically published his friend's works.
Including the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. That sounds potentially controversial.
It was, and publishing it wasn't a neutral act. The discourse questions why people submit to rulers. By carefully editing and presenting La Boétie's writings, Montaigne wasn't just honoring his friend.
He was doing something else.
He was positioning himself, aligning himself with La Boétie's ideas and, crucially, with the influential people who admired La Boétie. It enhanced his own reputation and network.
That's a calculated move. Now, what about Montaigne's encounter with the Tupinamba people from Brazil? It's often cited for his essay of cannibals. How does that fit into this political picture?
Well, again, Desan suggests it's not just philosophical curiosity. Montaigne met them in Rouen, and yes, he wrote about them, famously contrasting their society with European customs.
Critiquing European society in a way.
Exactly. He used the encounter and the essay as a way to comment on European governance, on its flaws and assumptions. By holding up this other society, he was implicitly questioning the way things were done back home. It's a subtle form of political commentary.
Okay, so then in 1570, he resigns from the parliament. This is usually the moment we picture him retreating to his tower, right, to start the essays.
That's the standard story. But Desan reads it differently. Not necessarily a full withdrawal, more like a strategic shift.
A shift towards what?
Towards cultivating connections differently. After leaving the parliament, he wasn't just sitting in his library. He was actively networking, building relationships with powerful nobles, like the Marquis of Trans.
Why was that important?
Because in that era, advancement often depended on patronage, on clientelism. You needed influential friends, patrons. These connections, these honorific rewards, they were the currency of power and influence.
So the essays, the first edition published in 1580, Desan sees this as part of that strategy,
Yeah.
not just philosophy.
Precisely. The argument is that the 1580 essays were, in a sense, a kind of political discourse. Think about essays like a discourse on my life and actions. You could read that as Montaigne showcasing his character, his judgment, his moral fitness for, say, diplomatic service or some other high office. He's presenting himself.
Almost like a CV, but in essay form.
In a way, yeah. Even something like Of the Battle of Gods, analyzing conflict and strategy, that would certainly resonate with people in power dealing with war and negotiation. So you see, reading them purely as timeless wisdom might miss a key dimension. They were written in a specific time, for specific purposes, at least in part.
That really changes how you might approach them.
It does. And, exploring these kinds of nuanced interpretations, looking beyond the surface, is something we try to do in our discussions here. And it's similar to the kind of analysis you might find stimulated by resources like Mindful Moments, too. It encourages that deeper critical thinking.
Right. Okay, so after publishing the essays, he travels to Rome. Was that just a health trip or a pilgrimage?
Desan suggests it was probably more than that. The trip in 1580-81 likely had diplomatic ambitions behind it. He met with important people there, like Paul de Foix, an ambassador.
Did it work? Did he get a post?
It seems not. He actually ran into some trouble, some suspicion of heresy from the church authorities, which wouldn't have helped. But he did achieve Roman citizenship, which was a notable honor.
And he revised the essays while he was away.
He did, influenced apparently by conversations with monkish doctors, as he called them. This shows he was aware of how his work was being perceived and the need to, let's say, manage potential criticisms.
Then, almost right after Rome, he gets elected mayor of Bordeaux. Not once, but twice.
Yeah.
That hardly seems like someone who's withdrawn from the world.
Exactly. It completely contradicts the recluse image. He served 2 terms, from 1581 to 1585. And while he later downplayed his impact, saying he left no trace,
Des found otherwise.
yes, research shows he was actually quite active, especially given the circumstances. It was a time of intense religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Montaigne had to navigate that.
How did he handle it?
He seems to have acted as a mediator. A negotiator, Desan calls him a tender negotiator, trying to keep the peace between the factions, maintain order in the city. That required real political skill.
So, a very practical politician when needed.
Definitely. And his political involvement didn't stop there. After his mayorship, between 1585 and 1588, things remained volatile. France was in turmoil.
What was he doing then?
Desan points to evidence of him undertaking secret missions, likely trying to mediate between political players. He even got arrested and briefly thrown into the Bastille in Paris in 1588.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it highlights how involved he still was. He was also present as an observer at the Estates General of Blois, a major political assembly, during a period he himself described as one of public ruin. He was right there watching it unfold.
So where does the image of the philosopher in his tower come from then, if he was so active for so long?
Desan's argument is that this image really takes hold later, in the final years of his life, from about 1588 until he died in 1592.
Why then?
Possibly due to political setbacks, disappointments. Maybe the path of public service didn't lead where he'd hoped. So in those last years, he did turn more intensely to his writing, revising and expanding the essays. The withdrawn philosopher image might be less of a starting point and more of an end point, a consequence of his political life not quite panning out.
Fascinating. So the big takeaway from Desan's work is really a fundamental reframing. Montaigne wasn't just pondering life in isolation. He was deeply engaged, a political actor whose writing and ambitions were completely intertwined with the chaotic times he lived in.
Absolutely. It forces us to reconsider that traditional image. And it raises a really interesting question for you listening right now. How does understanding the political context, the ambitions, the circumstances of any writer's life change how you read their work? Does it shift your interpretation fundamentally?
That's definitely something to think about. It adds a whole new dimension. Well, if this conversation has piqued your interest, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our future explorations.
And please share this with others who might find this different view of Montaigne interesting. If you want the full detailed argument, we really recommend picking up Philippe Desan's biography, Montaigne, A Life. We've put a link where you can find it.
And most importantly, keep questioning, keep thinking critically about the historical figures and the ideas that shape how we understand ourselves and the world.